All right, welcome everybody to the Missive. This is our GURPS Actual Play podcast, hosted by me, Brett Calhoun. We wanted to do something special and unique going into this. If you've been following this channel, you might have already caught our previous episode. However, I feel like we kind of just jumped right into things, and I want to provide some context as to what has all happened, why are we doing this, and describe some of the characters, what's come before, and maybe what will come later, and kind of just get all of those details out there. So first and foremost, what is the Missive? So the Missive is it's a Cold War pulp story. Try to imagine James Bond meets Indiana Jones, and this is actually our second campaign. However, we didn't record any of the other stuff before. The reason why is essentially just my own technical ineptitude. As Taylor will say, I am not good with tech. And we've done some previous recording stuff before. It just never worked out all that well. Audio issues, video issues, tons of stuff. And so finally, I was kind of doing some experimentation and everything started to work out well. So I was like, well, let's, better late than never. Let's start now. So I hope you guys are liking it so far, and I think this recap will really help explain things as we move forward. Another question a lot of people are going to have is, what is GURPS? How does this story work and stuff? So without going too deep into the woods, GURPS is essentially, it's a tabletop role-playing game. A lot of people will probably think of like Dungeons and Dragons, maybe Call of Cthulhu or Shadowrun and stuff. GURPS is a little bit more of a niche thing. However, it's a lot more custom based. So lots of people you can create anything in any time, in any place. So you can use the system for space. You can use it for modern day. We can use it for the 1960s, like what we're doing here, and so on and so forth. So it's a fantastic system. All of our players are addicted to it. We love it. We can't imagine going to really anything else. So we decided to stick with that. And so when we mention stuff like self-control rolls or making rolls and stuff, what we're doing is we're letting the dice decide on actions and such. So instead of if this was just fan fiction or whatever, we can't just say our character does something. We have to roll a dice to see, do they actually succeed? If they fail, then that can lead to all sorts of other interesting things, as you guys may have already seen or will see in the very near future. So with that, let's get into the Missive, the actual story in and of itself. It all starts with, obviously, a missive. What is it? So in the 1960s, we have a letter arrives to the FBI San Francisco field office from a Professor Junpei Kobashigawa. Seemingly innocuous, he's a professor of East Asian Studies and Chinese History and Sociology at UC Berkeley. However, his letter alludes to that something ominous has happened out in the Pacific, presumably in Hong Kong, and he's gone missing, and there are a lot of questions as to what's going on. And strangely enough, a lot of people are very interested in this professor's disappearance. Some of those people are in academia, some of them are in the government, some are in the military, and some are even in private industry. We'll get into some of those, but I think what's most important is that we get into our fellow cast and crew. So with that, I want to introduce all of our players. I'm going to start out with just naming them, and then I'm going to let them take the wheel briefly and explain their character as much as they want, and also, if they can, explain why is their character involved in the Missive. So with that, first and foremost, we have David, who's going to be playing Sawbones Sullivan. We're going to have Ingrid, who plays Melody Hendricks. We have Taylor, who played Johnny Cruz and is now playing Frank Washington. We'll get more into that later. We have Jamie playing Professor Jade Callan. And we have Cletus, who plays Reggie Thomas. So with that, I'm going to then go in that order and just have our players introduce their characters. So, David, tell us a little bit about Sullivan.
Well, Sullivan was born in Ireland and came over when he was 15 to Boston. and had a little bit of a rough childhood, but was able to, despite his heritage, become a doctor. Although through a little bit of unscrupulous means, he ended up in a position to, how do we say this, inform on some of his fellow unscrupulous Irishmen in Boston, and along with that, he found a FBI agent, who I'm sure we'll learn about later, by the name of Duncan, who also had a growing ambition within the FBI. But because of this, Sullivan was forced into a witness protection of sorts, and is very reliant upon the FBI now, as he has some enemies back in Boston. And he is on this missive as a part of the FBI attachment, as a medical doctor, and a little bit under the thumb / paired with the FBI agent Duncan.
Yeah, so I love Sullivan's dynamic. In GURPS terms, Duncan is an ally of Sullivan, which means that David actually had to spend points to get Duncan to essentially be somebody that he can rely on.
Yes, in
However,
GURP terms only.
Yes. Now, see, here's the key point here for everyone to understand. Just because you have points in an ally doesn't mean that they have to like you or you have to like them. And Duncan is not a very likable person. So we have a very fascinating bunch. I love all the players and their characters. However, the thing that's always been fascinating with Sullivan is that he's not really interested in the overall plot. He's really just like, I need to survive this and not get executed by the mob in Boston. And that's really the main crux of his character, for now at least. We might see some development.
Right. The only other thing I would say is that he's a real big guy, and he likes to use his presence to intimidate others, and he's a little bit of a drunk.
Yes, he is. I think that's a good description of Sullivan. So then let's move on to our fabled private investigator, Melody Hendricks. Ingrid, you play her.
I do. Thank you, Brett. Melody is a young 22-year-old Chinese-American woman who comes from California. She is a private investigator who went to Berkeley and studied criminology. She has always been around loved ones and really has a thirst to prove herself. She has an insane curiosity and constantly gets herself into maybe situations that are a bit beyond her capability, although she would tell you that she is fully able to handle anything that comes her way. She is very adamant about self-control and discipline, bit of a goody two-shoes, and somewhat opinionated in that way towards her fellow companions on the journey. She was pulled into this because her best friend's father is the missing professor. Mm-hmm. And by extension, her best friend, who had recently joined the Peace Corps, had not been heard from for a while. So, as I'm sure we will see, some of the impetus for her joining was to go find her friend in Peru. So Melody is a bit naive, and she can sometimes show that, but she's real fun to play. So, all right.
And I think, to me, the thing I love most about Melody is that she is sort of the conscience of the party. We definitely have various levels of morality in the party. With, I would argue, Sullivan and Duncan being on one end of the spectrum. I think Melody is on the opposite end of the spectrum. Somebody who is I would argue, generally good. If we had to make that a objective perspective.
Yes. She's a skilled martial artist, but a true pacifist, and has a very strong distaste for physical violence that is not absolutely necessary. She's also a very private person, and some things about her might come known as the story goes on.
Yes.
Oh,
All right, then I think we're going to then move on to Taylor. Now, Taylor, as I mentioned before, Taylor is playing two characters. One he is no longer playing, and we will get into why that is. But we're going to leave his second character to the side for now, and we'll address that later on in this recap. So first, Taylor joined the game as famous actor Johnny Cruz. Taylor, describe Johnny Cruz to us, please.
Johnny Cruz was a young, up-and-coming actor who had just came off the back of a successful film and wanted to essentially method act his way into the new American spy thriller. And so he met with Willard White, who financed his old movie, and ended up going on this expedition to get some real-life experience to make the movie more authentic.
What's his personality like?
He was like really outgoing. At least tried to be charismatic. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But yeah, he genuinely just kind of excited to help and very goal focused with his movie career.
Yeah, we actually I did a lot of research at the time period to kind of look at what movies would a famous up and coming actor be in and stuff, and we created our own sort of movie, The Long Afternoon, which is a movie starring John Wayne, Raquel Welch, and Johnny Cruz being kind of a new side actor. One of the many cowboy movies that was coming out in the 60s. And so I think that was just perfect in how he segued in. And that's essentially how he met Willard White, who we'll get more into, but essentially private industry funded this film. They liked having him around. And so for the most part, Johnny Cruz's role was fascinating because he wasn't on a mission. He was really just hanging out. I would argue, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, like I mean, he wanted to get the experience of being around and doing quote unquote cool stuff.
Yeah,
but he wasn't officially like roped in by the FBI or some other entity or even Willard White. Like he was paying his own way and everything else. He was basically just invited along for the ride.
Right.
And in his enthusiasm, he decided after talking to Willard to try to be a double agent against the enemy, and he was willing to take that risk. And then a rogue communist FBI agent decided to try to frame him for communism, and so now he's awaiting trial. So we'll see if that ever resolves.
Yes, we'll get more into that and possibly some other perspectives later on.
There's no other perspective.
Yes, I know.
There's only the truth.
Yes, of course. But yeah, so unfortunately, Johnny Cruz is no longer with us. However, he may not be gone for good. But we're going to continue on. Jamie, you play Professor Callan, and describe her a little bit and her role in the party.
Okay, so Professor Jade Callan is a sociology professor at UC Berkeley. Kind of how she gets tied into this party. She, the missing professor, is a mentor and now colleague of hers. So she more or less tries to be the leader of this group, I guess. She definitely has a little bit of an air of superiority to her. She knows she's smart. I mean, she's a professor, and she has little patience for those she deems not as smart as her.
Yeah, I would argue that she definitely had some struggles with Johnny Cruz and possibly some of the other dumber members of the party.
Mm-hmm. She is a little bit younger for she's early 30s. So hasn't been a professor super long or anything, but she definitely puts herself as above some people more than others. Put it that way.
Yeah, and I think we'll get more into that in the coming recap. But I think a thing that I love about Professor Callan is that she is certainly the guiding hand of the party. Whether she's in charge or not in charge, she is the most rational, commonsensical person. And that's not even just the fact that she has the advantage of common sense, which is a game mechanic. But it is also, I think this comes from just Jamie's contribution to this game, is she is able to explain why maybe we don't do dumb stuff. And sometimes we listen, sometimes we don't. And that can be good. It's good to have an adult in the room sometimes. But all right, thank you, Jamie. And that's going to leave us then with Cletus, who is playing Reggie Thomas, the hedge fund financier for one of the companies that is going to be supporting the party moving forward. Cletus, could you tell us a little bit about your character and what he does?
Yeah, so Reginald Thomas, he is like you said, he's a hedge fund guy. He's working for White Ivory. He's kind of trying to figure everything out right now. He is very successful in his past. However, I think there's a lot of unsure, kind of aspects of what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of trying to figure it out. He's pretty young. Fairly young character, a little awkward for most encounters. I mean, I think he kind of goes in over his head sometimes and gets over involved in situations, which
I think that's certainly true. And something that I think I really appreciate about your character is the fact that, similarly to Johnny Cruz, his character is very disconnected from the others in the fact that he is essentially his own master. Like he doesn't work for other people. He's plenty wealthy on his own, but he does have a genuine reason to be there, which is essentially basically to keep an eye on like the company and make sure that the company's interests are taken care of.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's a lot like maybe tension between him and Willard. And like with the whole Philip Roth situation, I think there's a lot of tension going on there too, because he thinks that he can, make his own decisions, and at the same time, he wants to he is growing attached to the characters that are like alongside of him in every situation. So he is starting to consider their opinions and stuff more. However, he is overconfident, so a lot of times he kind of just goes and does whatever, decision that he would.
Yeah, absolutely.
Think would be correct,
I think that speaks to just some of the cool parts about him is the fact is that he is independent of Willard, but he also is still essentially a facet of his company. And so like what you mentioned with Phil, it's like there are times where people will ask stuff of the company that might be beyond Reggie's grasp. However, then he has to go to Willard, and that can be difficult because especially when there's that tension there of, hey, I finance you, like you kind of work for me as well, but he happens to have more stock in the company than you do, which makes it can be tricky, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I initially I didn't expect necessarily all these situations to come up as far as like the business dealings go, but it's honestly a very good it's a very good idea, and it plays into his character really well, giving him his own opportunities to make decisions like on his own and kind of leave everyone else out. And that's like kind of his character is like, okay, I'm going to make this decision on my own because I'm this new investing tycoon, and I think I can do it myself because he did get a lot from his parents, although he is very hesitant to kind of reveal that to the party, and he likes to tell everyone that he's self-made, which isn't entirely true, but that's just kind of his personality.
Yeah, absolutely. So. Well, I think it's going to be interesting to see how he continues on in this story, especially as we get closer to the end of this big arc that we're going through right now in Peru, and see what happens. All right, so that's everybody. Now, there's a couple of NPCs I want to get into before we get into the recap. Now, we've heard some names, and I think it's really important to discuss them because they're going to come up again in the future. So the first and foremost is Willard White. Now, Willard White is a fascinating character And once again, this game is set in the 1960s. However, that means that I did do a decent amount of research into the 1960s. We actually try to stay pretty historically accurate. Now, we will obviously Hollywoodize stuff, change history if that's what the story demands. However, for the most part, we've tried to keep things as realistic as possible. So Willard White is a fictional person, but he is a oil baron from Texas who essentially started his own business, White Ivory Industries. And that business just exploded into all sorts of other different types of subsets that his company now owns. So they make movies, they make all sorts of commercial products, and what he's most famous for now is his hotel chain. So very much like the Hiltons or Trump Tower, he has his own ivory towers, so to speak, that is kind of across the world. And that makes him perfect for espionage stuff, because essentially his largesse enables people to kind of latch onto him, and he can go from place to place, and people can say that, well, I work with or work for Willard White, and this is the reason why I'm in this foreign country doing stuff for him. He's very eccentric, as many of the party members know. Very brash, very emotional. So he is a very volatile character with a substantial amount of power over the other party members. However, they have their own ways of pushing his buttons and getting him to do what they want, which makes him a very fun character for me personally to play as with the other players, to just see how do they react or what do they do to amuse him. And so he is a central figure in this, and we'll be seeing him frequently throughout this campaign. Another character that is worth bringing up is Special Agent Duncan. Now, this guy has been brought up by David. This is essentially Sullivan's handler. He handled Sullivan during the Boston incident with the mob, and they definitely did some shady stuff there. And he's continued to have a sort of a mutual reliance shared with Sullivan. So essentially it is an allyship where they're not friends, but they do need each other. And it's very important that they continue to rely on each other from Duncan's perspective. Now, with that said, I did a lot of consultation with some other people on what's an FBI agent going to look like in the 1960s. And it's a really interesting perspective because, I mean, time changes a lot. And I mean, when I think of FBI, usually I think of like Fox Mulder or something like that from the 90s, which is even still very different from what we see with Duncan. Duncan is a thug with a badge through and through. I think we've all clearly seen that. And so he's arguably one of the meaner people in the party, but he also, just like Willard White, has his own buttons that can be pushed to get him to do what he doesn't want to do. And so lastly, I think that we're just going to get into now is how did this happen? So recap. So the other players, I want you guys to jump in as you see fit as we do recap, and we're going to explain this is how it started and how we've gotten to episode or session 16, which is where we began the podcast. So the first session, we begin in San Francisco in the 1960s. It's 1966. It's in the summer. So Vietnam is just kicking off. We're starting to have, the protests are going on. There are U.S. troops that are over there now, but we're not quite in the heyday of it yet. It's not yet like 1968 during the Tet Offensive. We're definitely not in the Nixon era yet that is most frequently looked at when it comes to the Vietnam War. But with that, we kind of look at San Francisco and we kind of gather our crew and they come to a prestigious hotel that's there, I believe it's the Fairmont Hotel, and essentially they all have letters asking what are they doing there or to get there essentially and how they can play a role. And so they attend this classified meeting that's run by several different types of government folk. chief among them is Linus Coldstone, who is one of Robert McNamara's whiz kids, who represents the United States senior level government personnel, and he is directing things. However, alongside him, you have Senior Special Agent Larry McDonald. You have an unidentified shadowy figure, as well as Chancellor Roger Haynes, who's in charge of UC Berkeley. And he's the one who essentially assigns Jade Callan to go with the party. And as well as he oversees the fact that Professor Kabashagawa is missing, that is his employee technically. So they all gather, they compare some notes, they look at, okay, this professor's gone missing, and they make the determination, well, we need to track him down. However, a question comes up is that the letter that was written to the FBI in San Francisco was addressed to Professor Kabashagawa's daughter, who is May Kabashagawa. And this is where we get Melody. So May seems to have insight that could possibly crack the code on this very strange letter that was written. There's lots of callbacks to only stuff that she might know. And there's some weird things that he says that perhaps she can speak better to. And so the party comes to a decision right then and there that could drastically alter the rest of the campaign, which is, do we go to Hong Kong without May and try and figure out, maybe track him down some other way? Or do we go looking for May, who has seemingly vanished in Peru while working for the Peace Corps? And this was a very interesting thing. I left this to the players to decide, and I believe everybody decided at the time that they should go to Peru. Taylor, do you recall, did anyone decide to side with going straight to Hong Kong?
I don't think anybody dissented, if I'm remembering correctly. No.
Okay. All right, so that became Oh, yes.
One thing to note about that, and just a little bit on Brett's GMing style, is that at that meeting there was a, what would you call it? Confidential information meeting that should we have elected to take the security clearance advantage, we could have had additional information on that, and none of the party did.
At the time.
That's
correct.
A very good point.
Frank
The
has,
FBI
right?
agent Duncan, who is Sullivan's ally, was in there, but just because he was Sullivan's ally does not benefit me as a player to that knowledge. And that actually comes up as kind of important later on with the
Absolutely.
Johnny Cruz situation. Yeah.
Yes. No, that's a great point. Yeah. So just like I mentioned before, GURPS has certain advantages and stuff. One of them is having a security clearance, and this is one of those where none of the players had security clearance starting out. And the way that we've rationalized it in the story is that if they ever so choose, they can spend player points to have security clearance. And essentially what it is that right now they're getting through the fast track of getting their clearance, but the paperwork hasn't been filed yet. And it really depends on if they ever decide to spend the points, then they'll get it. If they don't, then, well, the mission ended before they could get their clearance, which is very realistic for a bureaucracy, if I will say so myself. But yeah, so there was a second meeting.
I think Frank is the only one currently that has it, even like of the player characters.
Yes, absolutely. And I will say that, yeah, speaking to what David said, Duncan will occasionally tell him things that he shouldn't tell him. But that, leans into his allyship. But we should remember, too, that Duncan has his own agenda. And so he may share stuff with Sullivan that maybe isn't the full story. And I have to leave that to the players to figure out. But so we ended with that essentially and went into prepping to go to Peru. And there was some investigation looking into who is Professor Kabashagawa. And what we were able to glean, it seems, is that he was an informant for the FBI. And we're not sure, though, how that all played into things. But that's definitely a big piece to the puzzle. And so the party then leaves San Francisco, flies on a private jet with Willard White to Peru. And this is where essentially the main bulk of our story has taken place thus far. And starting out, the key objectives were track down May, who has gone presumably missing somewhere in the country. So the first thing that they do, I would say of consequence, is they attend a very fancy dinner party. And at this dinner party are all sorts of very important folks. There is Presidente Fernando Belaunde. There is his secretary, Raul Zapata. There's his underling, Manuel Sanchez, who seems to have a fixation on melody. He's fascinated for some reason with the fact that there's an Asian woman there. We also have a rather bristly, prickly guy by the name of General Juan Velasco Alvarado. And there are other business types there as well. And one other figure that might be worth noting is a Diego Vega Delgado, who seems to be on a very negative relationship with Willard White. Willard White seems to passionately hate, and that might lead into future things. But so at this big meeting, lots of discussions came up as to the state of Peru. Things seem to be shaky. There's also questions as far as Willard White's role there. Several people seem to have questions as to what is he doing here. And in fact, one of them, another member of the dinner party that I've yet to mention, was Philip Roth, a representative of Standard Oil in New Jersey, who seems to be running things as far as the oil barons stuff go in Peru. And so he was very, very curious about what Reggie and Willard White were doing down there, with the obvious concern of, hey, is this guy stepping into my turf? And so the party kind of mingled, and a few key pieces of information came up. One of them was the fact that there seemed to be something strange going on, a strange relationship between Phil Roth and Raul Zapata and Manuel Sanchez. These three seem to be conversing almost conspiratorially around the meeting and such, frequently casting glances at the party, eventually to the point of where Manuel Sanchez had to leave rather early into it. But additionally, we saw some other things. A big one was a meeting with none other than Mike Mishak. Mike Mishak is the Peace Corps representative there. He, of course, shows up late and smells terrible, and he's all grimy and stuff because he's been out in the wilderness for months on end. And he has his own story as to what's been going on with May and provides the first clues. Another thing, though, is this Diego Vega Delgado. Now, he is a rather fascinating individual who seems to be a Cuban businessman, and he runs his own oil company as well. And this is where we get into what Taylor was saying before, where Johnny Cruz and him seemed to really hit it off. They had a very nice conversation at the dinner party, and Diego seemed interested in hearing more about what Johnny Cruz is up to and seeing, what is his, how they can benefit each other. And so they arranged for a second meeting. So then, following that very important, big, fancy meeting, we had a couple things happen. So first and foremost, Mike Mishak explained to the party that, like, hey, I've been down south with the villages up down there, and May was dispatched out to Talara, Peru, which is up in the northwestern section of the country. And essentially everything was going great until around March of 1966, where suddenly all communication seemingly cut off. So she was there for about 3 months, and then suddenly we stopped hearing from her. And by this point, 3 more months have passed. And so there was a lot of questions to what's going on. But there's so much for Mike Mishak to handle that it's difficult for him to get all the way up to the opposite end of the country and investigate himself. So he has been dispatched as the lone person who speaks Spanish to work with the party in Peru and act as their cultural and language interpreter and help them navigate their way up there.
Doing a great job.
Yes, he is. And there's definitely been challenges with him, as we've seen. Just with his character, he is truly a member of the Peace Corps. He's a manly man, but he is not a violent person by any means, which sometimes puts him at odds with certain volatile characters like Sullivan and Duncan. But then we go to our second other thing, and this is where maybe more of our Cold War stuff comes into play. So Johnny Cruz goes to a second meeting with Diego Vega Delgado at a very swanky restaurant. And this is where we've already heard from Taylor's perspective. And I don't want to provide insider information to the others, but essentially Johnny Cruz met with a second person, a interesting man by the name of Angel Mora. And these two, we would say, probably started to pitch the argument that, hey, we want you to work for us. We want you to spy for us. And Johnny Cruz was being non-committal about it as best he can, but eventually Angel Mora put a briefcase full of cash in front of him and said, hey, take it or leave it. And Johnny Cruz went with it. Now, right after that, Melody, who is providing some surveillance, can corroborate some details. They then went back to the hotel where Willard White was and stuff, and Johnny Cruz told him, hey, this is what's going on. Duncan gets called up, and there was an altercation. An argument ensued. I won't get into the details of it, as I don't want to provide meta information. However, it eventually ended with Johnny Cruz being placed in handcuffs and led away and sent back to the United States for prosecution for espionage. Now, we don't know what's happened to Johnny Cruz since then. The last that he was seen was Melody racing back to the hotel to see him being led away in cuffs. But we don't know if Johnny Cruz's story is over yet. We just might hear again from that famous little actor in the very near future. So we'll keep our eyes and ears out open for that. Meanwhile, we were then introduced to another member of the party, which just coincided with the fact that Johnny Cruz just left the party.
Weird.
Yeah, it's crazy how that happens, huh? Taylor, describe Frank Washington and his role in the party.
Well, Frank Washington, his role in the party is he was assigned to go with them to protect Professor Callan. Because normally his job is Willard White's bodyguard.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he was a swamp man from Louisiana, and so he has a really thick, hard to understand, very Creole Southern type accent. Think Sling Blade,
which is not Creole. But
yeah, well, I try to change it a little bit for the Louisiana
I love it.
bit, but
I love it.
He got drafted into Korea as a truck driver, and through some happenstance and odd jobs and whatever, he ended up working for Willard, and then they escaped from the Cuban Rebellion together, and he's been with Willard ever since. And so that's pretty much Frank. He's a pretty simple guy, generally a man of few words, unless he feels like he really needs to say something. So in a lot of ways, he's very opposite of Johnny Cruz.
Yeah, Frank is the sheepdog of the party. I think of all members of the party, he could easily do the most damage and quite effectively. And once again, listeners, I want to just really emphasize here, the Sling Blade truck driver / bodyguard of the party is the only one with a security clearance. So just keep that in mind as we progress into the future.
Sometimes it's how government be.
Yep. And so he gets introduced, and that is where some information comes out that Diego and Angel Mora may have been secretly working for the Cuban DGI, which is essentially the KGB for Cuba. And that brings up a lot of concerns about danger. And this is essentially sets a lot of things in action. The fact that Johnny Cruz was taken away is the belief that Diego might try and impede on the party's exploration of Talara, Peru, and rescuing May. So Willard White immediately dispatches the party to travel by van from Lima to Talara, which is a substantial drive. And with the hope that essentially that the Cubans won't be able to set up any type of nasty snares for it. Now, someone did, though. And this is where things start to get dangerous. The party travels from Peru shortly later, or from Lima, excuse me. And about at the halfway point, at a checkpoint, they're held at gunpoint, some of them. And a bunch of banditos essentially try to kidnap certain members of the party, with Professor Callan seemingly being chief amongst them. Armed with machetes and pistols, these guys are definitely no laughing matter. And quite the bloody fight ensues, with many of them getting killed. Thankfully, Frank is at the top of his game and essentially kills almost all of them on his own. However, some of them do escape. And seemingly, they went back to report to whoever that they failed in whatever mission they had. But this did bring up the question is who sent them? Mike Mishak explains that that's not how banditos work. They don't raid a checkpoint with armed soldiers and try and kidnap people. You know, they try and rob people, maybe some human trafficking, but this is something different. This is something maybe more conspiratorial. But we don't have time to look into that, because right now May is much more important. And maybe it would have helped too if we had a survivor that we could interrogate, but Frank's so good at his job that none of them were able to survive that.
Some men just need killing.
Yep. Yes, they do. And so the party, with a brief stop in Trujillo, continues to Talara. And this is where the main portion of our story has taken place in. Talara, a small village with some oil prospects that's still very developmental. It's very rural out in the boonies, very close to the Ecuadorian border, is essentially a shell of its former self even. When they get there, they see that people are fleeing the town, and there are active military operations going on there, with the army quickly indicating that they're conducting anti-communist guerrilla raids. But Mike Mishak throws some water on that explanation because, well, there are no communists left. History shows us that the communists have been dealt with at this point in Peru's history, at least for at that point. And so that brings up a question is, what is the military doing? Well, the first thing we do is we go to May's home. Is there a sign that she's there? Maybe she is there. We get there and we find a small house that's been ransacked. Everything's been turned over. There's signs of that somebody's tossed the place. And the party quickly tries to investigate and find some clues. However, they're left with little more than a burglar that they find trying to get his way out of the window. And after some harsh interrogation methods, it seems as though May has seemingly gone missing, that she's been kidnapped. So the next question goes to the district chief of the place, a rather large man by the name of Eduardo Gonzalez, who has seemingly replaced the original district chief, Pedro Ramirez. And questions quickly come to, where is this woman May? And strangely enough, he says, we have no idea who this person is. In fact, he has no answer whatsoever as to who May is. And this causes even more questions to arise, but he doesn't seem interested in answering them. And soon the party finds themselves scratching their heads saying, what do we do now? So they go to the local inn, and some clues start to find their way to them. A distraught woman by the name of Maria Escobedo sets up a clandestine meeting with some of them at her home late in the night, explaining that there's a lot more going on, that Pedro Ramirez was taken away, labeled falsely as a communist, that so too seemingly was May. And then also that there seemed to be something shady going on with Standard Oil and their whole role in the town, as they still have their whole setup in the western portions of the town. And then we look at something else that happens late in the middle of the night. Some goons come by and rough up the local innkeeper and start asking questions, followed by more goons that show up with a business card for Reggie saying that Phil Roth wants to meet. That's right, Phil Roth has followed them, apparently, from Lima, and he's now there, and he wants to have a conversation. So a meeting ensues with Phil Roth, where essentially he offers help to the party. He says, I can help find and track down Mei Kabashigawa, but I need you guys to leave. And he has two other pretty big concessions he wants if he wants to provide help. One is fairly simple, although mysterious, which is that Mei must sign a NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, to simply say that she can't speak to anything that happened since she's been in Peru, for the entirety, essentially. An interesting thing, because this is the Peace Corps representative, what could she possibly have seen or done that would require such a thing, especially in regards to Standard Oil? The other thing, also straightforward, but a bit more cumbersome, is Phil Roth has a bone to pick with Reggie Thomas. Reggie screwed him out of a pretty big deal in, I believe it was Brazil. And essentially, he wants that deal to be reopened, and essentially at a humiliating cost to Willard White. Of course, Willard White doesn't go for that, and this quickly places the party in a very tenuous position as to what do we do, because we can't convince Willard White to give away a massive chunk of his business, but we also need to get Mei. And so this did cause a lot of questions to come up, because some members of the party, the usual suspects that are of low moral character, shall we say, kind of came to the decision of maybe we don't even need to get Mei. Things seem to be pretty hard. Things are dangerous out here. What if those banditos come back? Let's just bail. That was an option that was on the table. And then, of course, we had the other side, as I said before, with Melody, who essentially said, hey, we need to get her. This is our mission. This is my best friend. We need to help this person. And that argument has continued pretty much all the way throughout most of this campaign, I would argue, with it coming to the head recently. Now, Phil Roth wasn't just hanging out alone in his compound. No, he had some people keeping a very close eye on the party. A couple of goons in a car that essentially just did surveillance, very overt. They sat in the car in the parking lot, watched what the party did, and that was that. And eventually things came to a bit of a head. Before we get into that, there was one other key thing I think that's worth bringing up, which was the party had a little bit of a field trip to the local military garrison. And this is where Sullivan especially kind of became helpful. As the party essentially claimed to be Peace Corps representatives with Mike Mishak and used Sullivan's knowledge of human physiology to say, hey, I'm a doctor, let me provide free checkups on your men. And the commander of the place, a Colonel Benitez, was more than happy to oblige him. And so they looked at the soldiers there, they heard some of their stories, and they noted that there was a prison on a small little connecting island right off the coast that seemed to be a place that was off limits that they couldn't go to. Sullivan somehow got on that little prison island and saw that none other than Mei Kabashigawa was there, as well as some other people. And thus they now knew that she was there. But this came up the question of as well, how was Phil Roth going to possibly help? You know, does he have connections with the military that we don't know about? And also Mei had been a bit roughed up recently, as Phil had continued to apply pressure to the party, especially Melody, with a photo of her with a black eye. Now, this caused Melody to somewhat tip her hand, arguably, as she claimed to be, incorrectly, to be Mei's sister, which Phil Roth seemed to find very interesting. And he then dispatched his hired muscle, Harvey, to do a spot inspection on her bags when they left a meeting. And it was there that he possibly got his hands on some of Melody's very detailed notes as to what all has been going on. And there's no telling what he now knows. So when the meeting ensued afterwards, Sullivan decided to be a bit, we'll say, take the initiative. And he confronted some of these surveillance people late in the middle of the night. This unfortunately did not go well. Sullivan, who has a bit of a temper, lost his temper and assaulted one of the surveillance guys. And with Mike Meshach next to him, they quickly got into a fight for their very lives. And eventually, Sullivan, being a pretty good boxer all around, easily defeated these two guys. However, it then came up the question of what do we do with them? Because if they get released, they're going to run right back to Phil Roth and tell him what happened. And possibly then that might be grounds for these people to get arrested or whatever. And so then it quickly came down to these two guys had to disappear. They had to go in the dirt forever. And Duncan was more than happy to oblige in that. And interrogations ensued where it was revealed that there truly were no communist guerrillas in Talara. That it all was a ruse by some weird, unholy union between Standard Oil, the military, as well as some government goons like Raul Zapata and Manuel Sanchez. So with that, though, these two men were essentially executed out in the desert, which definitely left some emotional scars for Professor Callan, as well as Mike Meshach, and maybe even a little bit of Melody Hendricks. And that quickly caused things to get to where they are now, with the surveillance team seemingly having vanished. Another team showed up in the following morning, couldn't find them, and so questions quickly came as to what is going on. Phil Roth, maybe coincidentally, contacted Reggie Thomas again shortly after this disappearance was noted and called for another meeting with Reggie Thomas. And this time he only wanted to meet with him alone. Reggie, surprisingly, was very helpful and said, "I'll meet with you right away." However, then upon meeting with the rest of the party said, maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe you don't walk into a compound filled with armed men and a possibly malevolent figure and place yourself at jeopardy. Which then caused the party to have to resort to the classic high school trick of pretending I'm sick. And our helpful doctor prescribed Reggie Thomas with a rather helpful dose of emetic that caused him to puke his guts up. And that brings us to session 16, where the next episode is going to take place. Am I missing anything here, anybody? I know that I've been talking for a while here, but
No, you did a great job. I do have one point of clarification that I think is important. Before the cold-blooded murder of our minders that occurred, the way that happened was Melody had initially seen two other people watching us in the night, who seemingly were unaffiliated, because when Sullivan and Duncan went to investigate, they pulled out of the alley, nearly running them over, which is what instigated Sullivan going to talk to the Minders and try to get information from them about this car and who these people were. Then there was some disrespect on the part of those gentlemen, which led to a fight, and the eventual knocking out, and then the driving off and interrogation. So
that's a brilliant point.
Yes, and also that one of those people that were watching us, Melody did recognize as being from the checkpoint.
Yes, that is very important to remember as well. I think one other thing that I'd like to discuss is, because I remember, everyone, I did mention that this is also a pulp campaign. My games essentially operate in a literary world that is occupied by some very mysterious entities called, one of them is called Sutherland. And we don't know much about this man. And we're going to have a slight slightly small discussion as to what we think we know about him. I've run several campaigns set in this literary world, so the players have encountered this character before. However, in this campaign, they've only had a few times where they've seen something that's not quite right going on. First and foremost was a moment in Lima when apparently Professor Jade Callan went sleepwalking, and she started communicating something to Melody, telling her that time was drawing to a close, that whatever was about to happen was going to begin. And then later on, I believe it was a night before. Was it before or after the men were killed? I think it was the same night, actually.
I think it was same night or after. I think.
Yeah, I believe it was the same night. So on the same night, Professor Callan went missing from her very bedroom. And the party went looking for her and found her somehow on the roof. But there was some strangeness with this, obviously, beyond just the fact that she's on the roof. But Reggie Thomas didn't initially see her. He saw a very tall, ominous-looking man with incredibly dark skin, possibly African or African-American, with blue velvet gloves and a red gleam in his eyes, almost like a sheen of sorts. And he wasn't the only one who witnessed this. When Melody went to climb up to the roof to rescue Professor Callan, he nearly fell to her death. And this same figure once again appeared out of nowhere and essentially rescued her from falling and told her once again that time was drawing to a close. And so we've had two interactions now, and we may have another one coming up very soon if you're watching or listening to future videos. But this is an interesting character that's appeared more than once now. Oh, and I guess too we should mention Frank has also seen him, although he hasn't shared that with anybody. So that did happen one night. He merely saw him. But I think we'll close this recap with just this question of is from the players. You guys have dealt with this figure before, and we're obviously going to hear reactions and stuff to him later on. What is your take on Sutherland? Who is Sutherland?
Well, who would you like to go first?
I think you guys just jump in how you feel.
All right, well, I'll go first then. So I think as a player, after a few seasons of this now, I think he's basically a deity, akin to like part of a pantheon of gods, like the Greek gods or something, that squabble and bet among one another, and it's fight and play games and whatever, and we're just pawns in a game for them, and we just happen to have been chosen by Sutherland's team. That's essentially where I'm at. He's not benevolent, but he's not necessarily malevolent, even though he may do things that we would consider to be good or bad. That's pretty much where I land on him.
Yeah, and I think an important note I want to add real quick before I let the others jump in is there is something very special about the party. This is a homebrew thing, which is called lounge tokens. And you'll probably hear me mention that as we go through the game. And the players will definitely mention them when they're trying to get themselves out of hot water. This is a game mechanic that I created myself, which essentially is that the players seemingly, their characters, accrue little coins that just seemingly come out of nowhere, that appear in their pockets, in their bags, wherever. And these coins are used as a point-for-point basis to offset bad rolls, if they so choose. And so this could mean life or death, and it frequently does, where somebody's about to get shot with a bullet, and those coins magically disappear, and suddenly they manage to dodge out of that bullet at the last second. And so that is a mechanic that we have seen in the game, and it is something that is seemingly inherent only to the members of the party. We have never heard of Duncan or Willard White or any of the other NPCs or other characters having them. But this is something that is in game.
Although we do seem to have an inability to talk about them too, so I don't know how we would know.
Yeah. Well, yes, that's true. It is something where they conveniently forget about these coins. It's something where it's almost just like it out of sight, out of mind. But they are there. But Ingrid and David and Jamie, I'm gonna let you guys then now chime in. Who is Sutherland to you?
So I have a similar take to Taylor, but I don't necessarily think that Sutherland is some kind of celestial being or deity. I think rather he is sort of kind of on the opposite end of that, in the sense that he is purely and fiercely natural. And what I mean to say by that is in sort of a Cthulhu ancient monster that is so much bigger than anything we could possibly comprehend. It's sort of the embodiment of that great vastness of horror. But maybe not horror is the right word. I do agree that there are other entities similar to him that are in some sense warring or competing with each other. My take on it is that whatever Sutherland is, be it celestial, be it arcane horror kind of monster, I think what his goal is to essentially either take over Earth or find a physical presence on Earth, and by using the various parties we've had that have dealt with him, he sort of gets stronger with each time. And I think that his eventual goal is to essentially incarnate into some kind of physical presence. And yeah, the thing about him that I really don't like is that he really toys with the party, because he is, in a sense, omnipotent from our perspective. He has the ability to do anything he wants and force the party members to sort of do what he wants us to do upon threat of great destruction. And I love it as a player, but also as a character. It is so insane to be faced with this great force that you really can't comprehend, and in some sense helps you, and in other ways actively hurts you, because he is truly neutral in like the sense that we are ants to him. So anyway, or it, but him because that he embodies in that way. But I hate him so much.
Any other David or Jamie? Do you guys have any thoughts on Sutherland?
Well, this being my first experience with him, I don't feel like I know enough to even try to guess what all that is.
Yeah, I will say that it is I definitely understood and felt both Jamie and Cletus's, and the fact that, like, you know, other players would hear the name Sutherland and they would freak out and stuff, and they would be like, I don't get it. What's the big deal? And that's just something where I like having fresh eyes to see this and make their own opinions and stuff. So, Jamie, I'm very curious to see later on as the story develops and stuff what your opinion becomes of this. But David, I guess I'm assuming you have your own thoughts on this.
Well, being the most senior Sutherland aficionado, we'll say. Although Taylor and I have been around.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think at least you and I have been around the same amount of time.
I know that Sutherland is, well, I think he is either an avatar or an agent of some aspect of these aspects that either are just innately part of the universe, like Ingrid was saying, or whatever fuels their powers is kind of siphoned off by them, or something like that. Where, if I had to guess, I would say the aspect that Sutherland represents would be something along the lines of order or discipline or balance or possibly hierarchy, because he always seems to be trying to restrain another force. And we think that he has a superior in some way, but
that remains to be seen.
Yeah, he's an asshole. So,
yeah, of our players, I think David is probably the most passionate about murdering him one day. Which, good luck to him. Yeah. And so I think that is our recap. That is the missive. That's the story so far. We're very excited to share this with you all. And to my players, I'm so grateful and thankful that you all can join me on this journey. So we hope to see you in the future episodes. Catch us in the sessions. I've been trying to break up each session into smaller chunks, so it's a bit more easier to consume. But until then, we'll catch you guys on the next one. So see you around. Take care.
Bye.
see ya.